6 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, investigators were still going back to the place where it all began. FBI agents had returned to the area behind her home, searching again, looking again, apparently following up on information that had surfaced during the long investigation. And that raises a difficult question. After all this time, what were they still looking for? Nancy had disappeared on February 1st. By August, there was still no public answer about where she was, who took her, or exactly what happened inside that home that night. And now, according to former Pima County Chief Deputy Rick Castigar, the problems in the investigation may go much deeper than the public has been told. Welcome, everyone. If you have been following Nancy Guthrie's case with us, make sure you are subscribed, because there are several details here that deserve a careful look. We are going back through the timeline, the ransom notes, the FBI involvement, and one former law enforcement official's explanation of what he believes went wrong. At first, Nancy's disappearance was treated as a missing person case. She was an elderly woman with medical needs, and investigators had to consider the possibility that she had simply left the house. That was a reasonable question to ask in the early hours. But then, the evidence began pointing somewhere else. There was blood on the porch. There was evidence inside the home. And eventually, investigators learned about surveillance footage from a Google Nest camera showing a man approaching the house. The person in that video was reportedly wearing gloves and a mask, and the appearance of the figure raised serious questions about whether Nancy had been taken deliberately. That was the point when the case became something much more serious. And according to Rick Castigar, one of the biggest concerns was not simply what investigators discovered, it was what may have been missed before those discoveries were made. Castigar had spent decades working within the Pima County Sheriff's Department. He also knew Sheriff Chris Nanos personally and professionally for more than 3 decades. His criticism is his own assessment, and it does not by itself establish wrongdoing, but his experience gives his comments particular weight when he describes how he believes the department was being managed. One of the first issues he raised involved the handling of the ransom notes. The Sheriff's Department released the first 2 notes publicly. One demanded millions of dollars. The second claimed that Nancy had died shortly after being taken, and included the unusual phrase about having buried her with nature. The second note also contained an extremely specific detail about Nancy's Apple Watch, including its color and where it had reportedly been left in her bedroom. That detail mattered because investigators generally want to keep certain facts private. If a suspect later walks into an interview room and describes something that only the perpetrator should know, that information can help investigators determine whether the person is telling the truth. But something went wrong when those ransom notes were released. The notes were initially published without the Bitcoin wallet address being properly redacted. The Sheriff's Department later removed the material and released a redacted version, but by then, people online had already seen it. Internet sleuths followed the address and examined the transactions connected to the wallet. They reportedly found that the FBI had placed a small amount of money into it as part of an attempt to make contact with whoever was behind the ransom demand. Then, they found something even more revealing. A public message appeared at the wallet address. It said, "We are ready to pay. Contact us." The message was followed by a link to a private web page. For a case this sensitive, the exposure was potentially significant. The public had now seen an address connected to the ransom investigation. They had seen a message apparently connected to an attempt to communicate with the people demanding money. And once that information was public, investigators could no longer count on it remaining a private piece of evidence. Castigar described the release as a significant mistake. He argued that making the Bitcoin address public could create problems later because people could falsely claim that the address belonged to them. More importantly, He said it removed an investigative tool that could have been used to test the credibility of someone who eventually claimed responsibility for Nancy's disappearance. But that mistake opened a much larger question. Was it simply an embarrassing error in a complicated investigation? Or was it evidence of a deeper problem inside the department? Castigar believes the latter deserves serious consideration. He described Sheriff Nanos as someone who, in his opinion, became heavily involved in small operational decisions and made investigators afraid to act without approval. He said that kind of management could make experienced investigators hesitate at precisely the moment when speed and independence matter most. And then he connected that concern directly to the FBI. According to Castigar, the relationship between Nanos and the FBI had already been strained years before Nancy disappeared. He recalled that in 2016, while Nanos was sheriff, the FBI was investigating allegations involving members of the sheriff's department. Castigar said Nanos had asked the FBI to keep him informed about the investigation, but that did not happen in the way he expected. Castigar recalled Nanos becoming extremely angry and later criticizing the FBI publicly, even telling them, in substance, that if they wanted to learn how to conduct a police investigation, they should come and see him. That history matters, because Nancy's case required cooperation. The FBI was involved. Local investigators were involved. A task force was involved. And yet Castigar believes the sheriff's department maintained too much control over parts of the investigation. There is another detail that makes this especially difficult to ignore. The surveillance footage that eventually showed the masked figure was not initially part of the sheriff's department's investigation. Castigar said the department knew there was a camera outside the house, but because Nancy did not have an active subscription that stored the footage in the cloud, investigators moved on. Later, the FBI reportedly contacted Google and asked whether deleted footage could still be recovered. It could, and that discovery produced the image of the masked, gloved figure approaching Nancy's porch. That one piece of footage changed the picture. But it also left behind an uncomfortable question. If that camera footage had been recovered earlier, what might investigators have known sooner? And if the case was already showing signs of an abduction within the first few days, why were other parts of the investigation handled the way they were? Those questions become even more difficult when we look at what happened on Nancy's porch, because the handling of the blood evidence may be one of the most troubling details in the entire timeline. The blood on Nancy Guthrie's porch should have been one of the most carefully protected pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Instead, according to former Pima County Chief Deputy Rick Castigar, the scene was open to the public before investigators had fully established what they were dealing with. And that detail becomes especially important when you remember how little was known about Nancy in those first days. She was gone. There were questions about what happened inside the house. There were questions about who had approached the property. And there was physical evidence on the porch that could potentially help investigators reconstruct what had happened. Yet Castigar said members of the news media were actually standing in areas where blood had been found. News Nation was reportedly among the outlets that filmed the blood before the scene was properly secured again. After the footage became a national news story, the sheriff's department closed the area once more. For someone with a law enforcement background, Castigar said that was deeply troubling. But the larger issue was not just that the scene had been opened, it was what happened afterward. Investigators returned to the property more than once. Additional evidence was discovered during later searches. And that created a question that has followed this case. If investigators were still finding things after the original search, what might have been missed during those crucial first hours? Castigar was blunt when asked why the scene had been closed so quickly. His explanation was not based on a newly discovered piece of evidence. It was his opinion about the sheriff's management style. He suggested that the decision reflected an attitude of authority. The person in charge makes the call, and everyone else follows it. There is another part of the early timeline that deserves attention. At first, investigators had to consider whether Nancy had simply wandered away. She was elderly and had medical needs, so searching the immediate area made sense. But according to Castigar, the situation began looking like an abduction within the first few days. There was blood, there was evidence inside the home, and eventually there was that Nest camera footage showing a person approaching the house wearing gloves and a mask. The footage suggested that whoever approached the property knew where the camera was located. Castigar interpreted that as evidence of preparation. He believed the crime may have involved more than one person, although that remains his theory rather than an established fact. And this is where the investigation becomes complicated. Police cannot simply decide on one explanation and ignore everything else. They have to consider family members, employees, friends, neighbors, service workers, and anyone else who may have had access to the home or knowledge about Nancy. Castigar acknowledged that, but he believes the investigation may have spent too much attention on some possibilities while other leads were not pursued quickly enough. One example involves the family. According to the interview, there was an early focus on Nancy's brother-in-law. A source had reportedly told the journalist that investigators were considering him as a prime suspect. His and his wife's vehicle was seized, and their home was searched during the early stages of the investigation. There is nothing in the supplied material establishing that the family members were responsible for Nancy's disappearance. In fact, the discussion later makes clear that they were publicly described as cleared, although Sheriff Nanos subsequently emphasized that being cleared did not necessarily mean investigators had eliminated every possibility. What matters here is the broader question of investigative focus. Was the attention placed on the family early in the case a reasonable part of a standard investigation? Or did it create tunnel vision that delayed attention to the person who appeared on the porch? Castigar suggested that possibility. Then came another disturbing discovery. Gloves were found around the property, or just outside it, during a later search. On the surface, that might sound like potentially valuable evidence. But testing reportedly showed DNA associated with investigators, search and rescue personnel, or other people known to have been involved in the investigation. In other words, people who had been searching the property may have left their own DNA behind. Castigar described that as contamination and said it created another problem for investigators trying to determine what evidence belonged to the original crime and what evidence came from the people who later searched the area. That is a crucial distinction. In an investigation, finding DNA does not automatically tell you when it arrived. Finding a glove does not automatically tell you who wore it. And finding blood does not automatically tell you the entire story of what happened. The context matters. That is why preserving a crime scene is so important. And that brings us back to the FBI. Months after Nancy disappeared, FBI agents were reportedly back behind her home. Why would they return to a location that had already been searched multiple times? Castigar offered a possible explanation. The FBI had received thousands, even tens of thousands of tips. Investigators have to sort those tips, determine which appear credible, and then follow up on the ones that could potentially lead somewhere. So the FBI's return to the property does not necessarily mean investigators discovered a secret piece of evidence there. It could simply mean that a new tip caused them to revisit an old location. That distinction matters, because when people see federal agents returning to a missing person's home months later, it is natural to wonder whether something dramatic has happened behind the scenes. The available information does not establish that, but it does tell us something important. The investigation was still active. Castigar specifically rejected the idea that the case should be considered a cold case simply because 6 months had passed. He said the sheer number of tips required investigators to keep working through them and ranking them according to credibility. And there was another trail investigators had been following from the beginning. Neighbors were asked to examine their doorbell and security camera footage from the days before Nancy disappeared. Investigators were looking for unusual vehicles, unfamiliar activity, or anything that might have suggested someone had been watching the neighborhood. There was reportedly at least one piece of footage showing a vehicle leaving the area quickly, although the supplied interview does not establish that the vehicle was connected to Nancy's disappearance. This is where the case begins to look less like a single mystery and more like hundreds of small pieces that investigators have to fit together. A camera recording, a bloodstain, a glove, a vehicle, a ransom note, a Bitcoin wallet, an unidentified DNA sample. Each one may mean something, or some may mean nothing at all. The difficult part is knowing which is which. And one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence is the male DNA that investigators reportedly recovered. According to the interview, the DNA did not belong to Nancy's immediate family or known circle of friends. That naturally raises the possibility that it could belong to someone connected to the crime. But even that conclusion would be premature. As Ashley Banfield pointed out during the conversation, the DNA could theoretically have come from someone completely innocent, such as a delivery worker or another person who had been around the property. Castigar agreed. The source of the DNA matters. If investigators could establish that the sample came from an item connected directly to the person seen approaching Nancy's home, that would make it far more significant. And this is where modern genetic genealogy could potentially become important. Investigators can sometimes compare unidentified DNA against databases and look for family connections. That does not immediately produce a suspect. Instead, it can create a family tree that investigators must gradually work through, eliminating people who could not have committed the crime and narrowing the possibilities. It can be painstaking work, but there was another possibility Castigar raised that was even more striking. He believed investigators should consider whether Nancy could have been taken south toward Mexico. His reasoning was based partly on geography. Tucson is roughly 60 miles from the Mexican border, and Castigar argued that someone who had planned an abduction could potentially reach the border relatively quickly during the early morning hours. He also raised questions about whether investigators had thoroughly examined border-crossing footage from the relevant period. That was only his theory. There is no evidence in the supplied material proving that Nancy was taken to Mexico. But once he raised that possibility, another question followed. If someone had planned the disappearance in advance, how far ahead might they have prepared? And if they had prepared, could the ransom notes themselves contain clues that reveal how much the person knew about Nancy? Because there is one detail in those notes that may be more important than the money. It is the detail about her Apple Watch. And when investigators looked at what the note revealed, that tiny detail suddenly became much more difficult to dismiss. The Apple Watch detail may be one of the most important clues in the ransom note. According to the interview with former Pima County Chief Deputy Rick Castigar, the note reportedly described Nancy's white Apple Watch and where it had been left near her bed. That is unusually specific information, because it suggests the writer may have known details about the inside of Nancy's home. But there is a problem. That information became public. Normally, investigators can keep certain details secret and later ask a suspect about them. If the person knows something that was never released, that could potentially help investigators determine whether the person actually had inside knowledge. Once those details are published, that advantage becomes weaker. The same concern applies to the Bitcoin wallet. The address was reportedly exposed in the original release of the ransom material, allowing people online to examine the transactions and even see a message connected to the FBI's attempt to make contact. For Castigar, these were not isolated mistakes. He believed they reflected deeper problems in how the investigation was being managed. He also questioned why the FBI was not given a larger role earlier, particularly because Nancy's disappearance appeared increasingly consistent with an abduction. He argued that federal investigators had resources and specialized capabilities that could have been valuable from the beginning. But despite those criticisms, the case was still moving. Investigators had the surveillance footage. They had unidentified male DNA that could potentially become important if it could be connected directly to the crime. They had thousands of tips to examine. And months after Nancy disappeared, FBI agents were reportedly back near her home. We do not know from the available material exactly why they returned. It could have been a new tip, a follow-up search, or an attempt to verify information investigators had already received. Castigar also raised the possibility that Nancy could have been taken toward Mexico, given Tucson's proximity to the border. But that remains a theory, not an established fact. So has the investigation fallen apart? Not necessarily. What the evidence shows is something more complicated. Serious questions about the early handling of the case, combined with an investigation that was still active months later. The biggest question remains unanswered. Who approached Nancy's home that night, and what happened after Nancy disappeared? Until investigators can answer that, the ransom notes, DNA, surveillance footage, and every credible tip remain pieces of the same unfinished puzzle. And for Nancy's family, that unfinished puzzle is still their reality. What do you think investigators should focus on next? The DNA, the surveillance footage, or the ransom notes? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe if you want to keep following this case as new developments emerge.